Enter the world of the new Atlantis and take part in an ancient ritual. Face the mighty Leviathan to prove your worth. Take the ultimate test and rise to the challenge. Feel the thundering exhilaration of the world's most iconic wooden coaster, the Leviathan, rising 2nd of December.
Hi, I'm Chad Miller, one of the founders, owners, and engineers at the Gravity Group. We partnered with Martin Vleminckx Rides to design, engineer, and construct a wooden roller coaster called Leviathan.
Leviathan is the first modern-day wooden roller coaster built in Australia in over 30 years. The ride itself is a fast-paced, twisting, winding wood roller coaster. It is jam-packed from start to finish, from the first drop all the way to the brake run. There isn't a wood coaster like that in Australia. They haven't really experienced anything like it before. Village Roadshow had come to us and said, we would like a wood coaster in this kind of space at our property. We will take that information that we have from those initial talks and go to Gravity Group and say, what can you provide us for what they're asking?
We've partnered with Martin Vleminckx on several other wood coasters, primarily in China, and agreed to work with them on it. We knew early on that it was going to be a different animal, being that it was Australia. There were some indications early that things get built differently in Australia. Engineering review is different. And so there were some of those discussions early on just about our trains, some of the requirements for the control systems, the electronics. And then we started getting into the design. However, this was an extremely tight site. It's a fairly large coaster, so we had a lot of track to cram into a fairly small area. The park didn't have a lot of requirements in terms of what the ride layout was, other than it needs to fit in the space. We did have a fair amount of freedom to incorporate different things that we thought would be cool. There is an overbank turn and a 90-degree turn in the layout. As a company, we're huge on airtime. We love airtime. We put airtime in every place we can. And on a twisted up ride like Leviathan, that's not always easy. It's not like it's a big out and back with just hill after hill. But I think we did a pretty good job of feeding a lot of airtime into the design. Went through a few iterations. It was actually some of the initial iterations of the design were very similar to the Kima Boardwalk Bullet, which is also a lot of track crammed into a small space. And then we kind of evolved it from there to the point where it became its own ride. The park had very specific ideas about their queue line and their station building. Some of the things that they were responsible for that we needed to work around or help incorporate into the structure. They had a very elaborate queue line, heavily themed, and we needed to make sure that we allowed the space for that and allowed places where you could walk under the track.
At that point, the discussions with Village Roadshow theme parks had already been done. The contracts had been signed, and when I got hired on, we had started doing the fabrication in our shop in Haines City, Florida. We go through the plans that Gravity Group provides us of all the structure pieces of the ride, send it through our assembly line. All of those pieces get cut and drilled and packaged away and then shipped back to our lumber supplier. Once it's treated, it gets shipped to the job site. Once all of the fabrication of the structure was done is when we buy our plane tickets, pack our bags, and head on over to Australia to begin the installation of the project.
My first trip to Australia, in my whole life, honestly, was in August, I think, of 2018. It was kind of for the kickoff meeting of the project. We walked around a dirt site, talked about utilities and earthwork. But it was exciting to be there. I was afraid to drive on the left side of the road, so I rented an e-bike that I rode everywhere. It was pre-pandemic, of course, and so we had no idea what was coming.
Closer to home, and Queensland is bracing for an outbreak of coronavirus.
1 in 4 Queenslanders over the next 6 months will contract coronavirus. Health officials warn more than 1 million Queenslanders could be infected with coronavirus.
The pandemic hit kind of during the design process, and of course that set the project back at least a year. Probably by the time it was all said and done, it delayed it even longer than that.
The process of going to Australia at that time was extremely difficult. It was me and 3 other guys from the MBR team that went over there, and we had to have letters from the Australian government allowing us into the country, because at that time the country was shut down. I flew to Sydney. I was one of 27 people on my entire flight. I got shipped into a hotel in downtown Sydney and spent 2 weeks in quarantine. Once I completed that, I was back on a plane flying to Queensland and heading down to the Gold Coast to begin the installation of the project. I was the first member of MVR on site, and I was lucky enough to be there for 2 years of this entire installation of the project. When I got there, the site was just a massive concrete pad, no anchor bolts, nothing had been done yet. All of our materials, all of our wood and hardware and all that stuff had been shipped from the US. It has arrived on site. The first steps on any project is coming up with a game plan. So we split the ride in 4 sections. We want to make sure that the hardest places to get to are done first, and then the easier places are done last. So we start with the middle section of the ride and kind of worked our way around. The first couple weeks were just kind of training the team on site, the contractors on site, all the tradesmen, on how we do our installations for our wood coasters. My first role on the project was the fabrication team. So all of the pieces taken on site, all those standard and custom pieces, it's my job to take the plans and put all those pieces together on the ground. That entire process could take a day, it could take, a couple hours. And then once it's completed, we have what we call a bent. That bent is now transferred over to the second team, which is the installation team. So it's their job to take the pieces and start erecting them. So they take the piece with the crane, stand it up, make sure it's nice and plumb. Once we have a good run of pieces together, that's when our next discipline come into play, which is the team that starts installing the handrails and the walkways and kind of tying everything together to make sure it's nice and square, where then after that, our track team comes in and start installing the track of the ride. The track is all hand installed and hand cut. Teaching them how to cut track, how to get all of the measurements correctly. It was kind of my first real hands-on experience with project management with MVR. It was terrifying, to be honest. Seeing all the plans, I had touched and signed off every single piece of wood in our office in Florida, and now it's my turn to pretty much build the puzzle.
I was there 4 times in the period of, I think, 8 months. Typically, I was there to sort of troubleshoot sometimes or answer questions. A lot of work dealing with the trains, and we walk the whole track and look for things that might be in the way. And if we made a slight change, we needed to make sure that was reflected in drawings. We learned a lot, kind of the hard way, about working in Australia. They take safety and the protocols and the letter of the law very seriously. We kind of knew this going in, but we felt the brunt of it during the project.
They're very cautious when it comes to working at heights and making sure everybody has the proper training to use certain equipment, even just standard skill saws and drills. There's different trades that are trained into using those, so we kind of struggled with making sure that we had the right people that were trained so that we can continue moving forward in those areas.
The team in Australia, they're very by the book. They have protocols, and even just the park employees and the way they handle decision making and things is very structured. I was in a meeting once, and there was a conversation about some drawings, and the drawings had to be delivered to some people at the park from us. And there was a question like, should he just make a PDF and email these drawings, or do we want printed copies that we'll physically hand to the team? They hashed this out for 5 minutes about what, all the pros and cons of emailing them versus printing them. And it actually got down to the point where somebody said, well, if we print them, it's possible that somebody could spill coffee and ruin the drawings, and then what are we going to do? And I kind of stopped the meeting at that point and said, are we really having a meeting about what if somebody spills coffee on the drawings? And that's sort of the level of bureaucracy that we had to deal with in Queensland, Australia. Certainly something that we weren't used to, but in that case, it was mildly entertaining.
We're used to working very fast paced because we do a lot of stuff in China and the US. So moving over to Gold Coast where everybody's kind of working at their own leisure and just kind of going with the flow, and that was kind of a challenge for us for sure.
There are engineering codes that we follow. Codes aren't necessarily written specifically for roller coasters. They might be written for structures, and structures typically are going to be buildings and bridges and things like this. And we have to do our best to apply those codes to engineering of a coaster. That in itself leads to some interpretation. And we interpret it the way that made sense to us, the way that other codes around the world are written, the way they're interpreted. In an attempt to interpret them the same way, made decisions about the design of the ride that ultimately some of the review agencies in Australia didn't agree with. And so that resulted, towards the end of the project, that resulted in us having to design and install a lot of bracing, like reinforcements. And a lot of it came down to wind. Wind imposes a load on a structure, and we have to design the structure to be able to withstand that load. And the way we interpreted the code and how it applied to wind on our coaster structure was much different than the way the engineering review team and ultimately the government interpreted the code. We fought it, tooth and nail, trying to get them to understand where we were coming from and why our interpretation was accurate. But it ultimately did not really go that way, and in the end, we did what we had to do. That also led to some of the delay. But going into another Australian project, if we ever do, we'll hit the ground running in understanding how their codes work and what we need to do to satisfy you.
There's a lot of big milestones when it comes to ride installations. Step one, first milestone, structure. Once we had an entire ride completed and connected, that was extremely satisfying, but then you start thinking ahead. You're like, okay, well, we're done with the structure now, so now it's time to finish the track and the walkways and the handrails throughout the ride. Step three is making sure all of that is installed correctly to your standards. We have very high standards for our installations at MVR. It takes us about 2 to 3 weeks to go through the entire ride to make sure that everything that was installed is installed as per the design of the ride. So we do a kind of a pre-commissioning inspection. We give it the tick of approval before we can hand it over to the park and say, now it's time for you guys to do your inspection. We work so hard and we were there for so long to kind of see these come together. It's extremely, extremely rewarding.
So Leviathan has one of the coolest theme trains that we've ever done. The park is all in when it comes to theming. The eyes light up. There's a red glowing light inside its mouth. The fenders and the side panels are all done with like an iridescent dragon scale paint job. And then the head on the front, the Leviathan head, first of all, it's huge. It's one of the biggest fiberglass train fronts that we've done, which was really intense, sort of working with the park and with the fiberglass artists to coordinate everything and make that happen. We were given some some artistic direction and some 3D models, but it was up to us to sort of flesh it out with our fiberglass artists. But the end result is so cool, just to see the train, especially in the sun. I mean, it's always sunny in the Gold Coast, Australia. And when that train goes around and the sun's glistening off of it, you know, the light up eyes and everything, it's just so cool. Certainly one of my favorite train themes that we've done. The sister park to SeaWorld is Movie World, and it's also nearby there in the Gold Coast. And they had just been working on a project there where they had put a backwards car on one of their trains. And they were curious if we could do the same thing on Leviathan. We had another project, Itinéraire de Zeus, that we were refurbishing at Parc Asterix in France that had also asked for a backwards car. And so it was kind of our opportunity to go ahead and develop it. The Village Roadshow SeaWorld project was intended to be our first backwards car, but because of the delays with COVID and other things, it ended up not being the first. The one in France became the first backwards car. You know, we weren't necessarily sure how it was going to feel, how it was going to ride. To be honest, we didn't really do anything differently with the layout of the coaster. Kind of our philosophy was if you can enjoy it forward, then you can enjoy it backwards. It's just going to be maybe a little more intense because you don't know what's coming. Any layout we do, forward or backwards, we try to be careful with the transitions, make things smooth. So even if you don't see what's coming, we feel like it should still be an enjoyable experience. So finally, after working on this coaster for 4.5, 5 years, which is a ridiculously long time to be working on the same coaster, I did get to ride.
I was very lucky enough to be on the first train of people. It was about dusk, so the sun's setting over the water. My anxiety was really high, but I was also just really, really excited. And I sat right in the front row. Got to the top of the lift hill, big smile on my face, I'm looking at the beautiful Gold Coast, and then all of a sudden that train just pulls you straight down the first drop. It is fast, action-packed, weaving and winding through the structure. I had walked around the entire ride hundreds and hundreds of times, but actually riding it, I got like a little disoriented at one point where I'm like, I don't know where I am. Like, I don't know what post I'm at or something like that. But once I got back to the brake run, it was like massive, massive smile. And then I rode again for probably another 10 times after that.
When I work on a coaster, I kind of have in my head what I think it's going to feel like. I mean, that's part of the job of designing a coaster, is to understand in your head what the riders are going to experience. And so I already had a really good and fairly accurate image in my head of what I was going to experience. My first ride was what I expected, and it was really cool to ride it after having been working on it for that long. And then my second ride was in the backwards car. I didn't have a good image in my head of what that was going to feel like. I had ridden the backwards car in France already, so I did know what a backwards car on our train felt like in general. But this ride is so twisted up, and the direction changes are many. And when you ride it backwards and can't see where you're going, you can only see where you've been. It changes the whole perspective. And that ride, for me, leaves you speechless. I just sat there and was like,
Once we completed our commissioning and inspections, handing it over to the park and the contractor for them to do their inspections of the ride. Once that's done, then it's handed over to a third-party engineering firm that does an inspection of the ride. And then finally, the park brings in government regulators to then sign off the ride to make sure that everything is correct and you can start operating. The biggest smile that I had was opening day, seeing guests actually get on the ride. I waited outside the exit just to see their reaction. I saw a lot of people with some coaster hair, just big smiles.
You know, it's certainly their most popular ride in the park, which we knew it would be. You know, there's always people riding, there are always people in line. However, the backwards car, it seems, maybe gets less ridership than they anticipated. It is an upcharge. Some people might have ridden it backwards but weren't willing to pay for it backwards. So, you know, it's kind of remains to be seen how that all turns out. But all in all, I think the park's very happy with it.
Hearing the words from employees of the park and the executive staff of Village Roadshow saying how happy and pleased and thrilled they are with the final product of the ride is just really, really, really cool for me. On the Gold Coast and in Australia, a lot of people haven't experienced a wood coaster before. So seeing the reaction to that was just extremely rewarding. And that's kind of the main reason why I love my job so much, is because I could see these reactions of people on a final product that I provide them.